I am David Leigh. I'm the investigations editor of The Guardian, for those who don't know me. And the people I want to introduce you to are, on my left, Sandy Mitchell, and they're Mark Hollingsworth. Mark wrote the book Saudi Babylon, which is basically Sandy's story. And it's the story of how Sandy and others have been arrested, tortured, maltreated in Saudi Arabia. It's a story that's quite close to my heart, partly because I've known Mark for a long time as a very gifted author, and partly because on The Guardian we did quite a lot of work about these Saudi cases involving Sandy and others a couple of years ago. And it was one of the most horrifying stories I've ever had to deal with, really, because, as I'm hoping that Sandy will tell you, all these people were arrested, locked up, framed and tortured and accused of being basically Al-Qaeda bombers, all of which was completely false and was a fictional attempt by the Saudi regime to fix the blame for what was going on innocent foreigners. What is most extraordinary about this story is that in another age, Palmerston would have sent a gunboat for this. British subjects were arrested, imprisoned, tortured, framed, and the British government did nothing much about it. And to this day, they are still resisting attempts by the victims of this to get compensation. It's close to my heart because I spend my time writing stories at the moment about how the British government is leaning over backwards to suppress police investigations into massive bribery of the Saudi royal family because they don't want to upset them. And the story about how the British government doesn't want to upset the regime in Saudi Arabia is one of the more shameful stories of the 20th century, I think. What I'd like to do is ask Sandy if he would just tell us, briefly, just in a few minutes, what it was that the Saudi regime did to you.
Well, we were arrested in 2000. Immediately the torture started from day one, and it continued continuously every day and night until the 8th day. They wanted us to confess. They weren't interested in the truth. We're told from day one, we have it from the very highest authority to obtain your confession. And by the time you leave here, you'll be insane by the time we finish what we're doing to you. So eventually we had to confess to these crimes. But the Saudis lied to the world media. They told the world media that the bombings were down to a bunch of Westerners fighting over alcohol. That's not what we had to confess to in the torture chambers of Saudi Arabia. We were forced to confess to say that we were British spies acting under instructions of the British Embassy to carry out these bombings. So effectively they were accusing the British government of carrying out the bombings that Al-Qaeda were carrying out against British nationals in Saudi Arabia. The lie went on until May 2003, when suicide bombers took out 2 Western compounds. Then Prince Naif, with egg on his royal face, had to admit the truth. He had a problem with Islamic insurgents.
Prince Naif was the Interior Minister, wasn't he?
Yes, Prince Naif runs a kingdom within a kingdom. He's the Minister of Interior, and basically within the kingdom, he runs the country.
Mark, what's the picture that you've put together in the book? Tell me about it.
Well, I think actually at one stage I was going to call the book The Deal, in the sense of the really interesting thing for me was not just the torture and the unbelievable miscarriage of justice that took place with Sandy, where he was in jail for nearly 3 years, tortured for most of that time, didn't see a lawyer for 1 year. The British government did virtually nothing. They treated the case as if they were like social workers looking after someone who was a little bit ill. The thing that struck me about this story was actually not just that it happened, that was bad enough, but why it happened. And I think what, in a way, that makes this case so important is the importance of Saudi Arabia, not just in terms of the global economy, politically, and terrorism in almost every sphere, is why did the British government, knowing, because they had intelligence quite early on, that Sandy was innocent, that they knew, they had information within the first year of his imprisonment, that he could not have been a car bomber, that he did. It was impossible for him to have committed these crimes. And yet they allowed the Saudis continued the torture. They allowed him to rot in jail without a trial, without seeing lawyers, a whole litany of crimes and illegality. And I think what was significant for me was not just that this happened, but why it happened. And that's why I think one of the main reasons I was interested in doing this book, because it was a vehicle to explain the sort of unique relationship between the West and the Saudi royal family, and Saudi arguably being the second most powerful country in the world after the United States. And it occurred to me that there's basically a very insidious deal that has been covertly or that have been agreed over the years between the West and the Saudi, whereby the US keeps the Saudi regime in power, and in return gets cheap, plentiful oil. And whenever the American economy is in trouble, the Saudis will increase production of oil, and the price goes down, and that helps the American economy. They did that directly after 2001. They immediately pumped it. They increased production of oil to stabilize the American economy right after 2001. And basically a whole series of favors by the Saudi government for the Americans. I mean, they financed their foreign policy. They basically bankrolled American foreign policy throughout the Cold War in terms of supporting the Contras. The first Gulf War in 1991 was completely paid for by the Saudis. They basically wrote out a check for $12 billion. And there's basically this arrangement between the Saudis and the Americans. And in return for all the favors that the Saudis have done the Americans in return keep the Saudis in power. So when the 1991 Gulf War took place and Saddam Hussein was about to invade Saudi Arabia, had all his troops on the border, and the Saudis were like begging, crying for Americans to come in. And again, they wrote a check. And again, the Americans came in like the 5th Cavalry to bail them out. And because British foreign policy has been so closely aligned with the Americans, when Sandy's case came up in 2000, 2001, it was just so crude in the way that the British government, and Blair, when Jack Straw was Foreign Secretary, they clearly knew that they were not going to do anything, despite being British citizens being tortured and being rotting in jail. They did absolutely nothing. They kept saying they were negotiating. In reality, all they did was to make sure that Sandy didn't die. They didn't care how bad the injuries were. Their main concern was that he didn't die in jail, because then the political and diplomatic repercussions would have been phenomenal. And for 3 years, it was just unbelievable lies and obfuscations by Straw and Blair and most Foreign Office ministers, and they let him rot. And the reason they let him rot is because of oil and because of the arms deal between Britain and Saudi Arabia, the famous Ali Mamra arms deal, where the British defence companies, British Aerospace, basically kept going by this huge arms deal between Britain and Saudi Arabia. So Saudi is a real exception to any kind of objective analysis of foreign policy, and Sandy was basically the British government was willing to sacrifice Sandy and other British people in Saudi. And I think, in a way, for me, the bigger issues are as important as Saudi's human care, and I think that is as important and really needs to be exposed.
Sandy, I wonder if I can ask you, what was your reaction when you've seen in recent days the British Prime Minister, the British Attorney General, stopping a police investigation into bribery allegations against Saudi Arabia? What do you feel when you see them stand up and say these investigations have to be stopped?
In Saudi Arabia, life is cheap, and so is the rule of law. And it appears that the rule of law is also for sale in this country and is sold for favours from Saudi Arabia. I'm totally ashamed of my government. I've always been a patriot, proud to be British, but I'm totally ashamed of how low my government will stoop to kiss Saudi butt.
Well, Yeah, I can. I think you're better qualified than many to say that, actually. I mean, I have similar feelings. I'm sure Mark does, but we haven't had these experiences. Have you had any assistance from the British government to get redress from the Saudis for torturing you and framing you?
Absolutely not, and in fact, quite the contrary. When we won, we sued the Saudi government and the Saudi torturers in the courts in this country. We won our case in the Court of Appeals to sue our Saudi torturers. The Saudis appealed to the House of Lords, and the Foreign Office's Department of Constitutional Affairs intervened, granting state immunity to not only Saudi Arabia but to the individual torturers who tortured us. The British government decided that the individuals are also entitled to state immunity. As a result, any British national can be tortured now, and will have no possibility of legal redress in this country because they are protected by the State Immunity Act as long as torture is sponsored by the state in question.
Mark, is it your view then, having gone into this, that the position we've now reached is that Saudi Arabia can torture British citizens and demand bribes from British citizens, indeed, without any concern from the British government whatever?
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any accountability at all. And one of the people I interviewed was a guy called Brian Wilson, who's a former Blairite foreign minister at the early part of when Sandy was in prison. And he admitted to me he's now left office, and he was an arch Blairite, and he admitted to me that basically the Saudis can just get away with anything. And of course, the irony is 9/11, because the reason 9/11 happened is basically it goes right back to 1979, when there was an attempted coup by Islamic fundamentalists in Saudi when they tried to overthrow the Saudi regime. And basically what happened is in the early 80s, the Saudi royal family did a deal with the Islamic fundamentalists in Saudi. And they said, look, if you leave us alone, if you don't try and overthrow us, we will give you control over social policy, education, religious education. And what happened in the 80s, and that came up to the early 90s, is that basically this form of extreme Wahhabi doctrinaire form of Islam was taught in Saudi Arabia, and it resulted in, by the 1990s, a group of extreme militant Al-Qaeda activists, which of course resulted in 2001 and in 9/11. And of course, when 9/11 happened, the Americans didn't invade Saudi Arabia; they just let it go. And that was a sort of classic case of Saudi being a special case.
So are you saying that, in a way, this is a weird kind of blowback, that actually 9/11 was a consequence of our corrupted relationship with the Saudis?
Yeah, I think it was, in the sense of one of the most sort of important campaigning tools that bin Laden and Al-Qaeda had was the occupation by American troops after the end of the 1991 Gulf War. And when they basically the Americans came in to rescue the Saudi royal family, and they left American troops in Saudi after the end of that Gulf War, and that gave bin Laden in the early 90s a real opportunity, a vehicle to recruit. And they already, as I've just said earlier, they already had this new generation of Saudi young people indoctrinated by this extreme Wahhabi sect. And basically, you can argue that American foreign policy was responsible for 9/11 by this sort of deal that they allowed Saudi royal family to just do whatever they liked. And one of the things they did was they did this deal with the Wahhabi Islamic clerics. And they just, in the 1990s, the Americans and the British, and certainly the security service, went completely asleep about the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, and you had the explosions of the American embassies in 98, and you had the Khobar Towers in 96, and they just, because it was Saudi, their objective faculties just completely went out the window.
Sandy, what is it that you think that we should the British government should do about Saudi Arabia?
Stand up to them, enforce the rule of law. The rule of law should apply to everyone, regardless to how much oil they have and how much we depend on them for trade. We depend on lots of countries, but everyone obeys the rule of law. Saudi Arabia is exempt from that. The House of Saud is exempt from that. They have a rule and their law unto themselves. And to be perfectly blunt, there's not much difference between them and the Cosa Nostra family.
Well, what's your reaction to the claim that's been made by the Prime Minister and by the Attorney General that Britain's national security depends on us keeping on the right side of the Saudis, whatever they do to people like you, or whatever they do by way of taking bribes?
Saudi Arabia doesn't do wars. We do not depend on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia depends on the West for their security, to prop this corrupt family and keep it in its regime. Without the West, the House of Saud would not exist. They'd be brought to justice as Saddam Hussein has been, and Arabia would find a new way of moving on. We don't depend on Saudi Arabia, and our government should recognise that. They depend on us.
The trouble is, I remember, and I've been guilty of it myself, in the last 20 years there have been numerous claims that the House of Saud is so corrupt that it is on the verge of collapse and that any day now it's going to go. And it never has. It seems very, very stable. I mean, Mark, is there any way in which the House of Saud is going to be got rid of?
I don't think so. I mean, I think because of their security operation, which is actually, with the Americans, got advisors there constantly. I think the problem is the opposition rather than it doesn't seem to be any real opposition. About 10 years ago there was a movement largely based here, a man called Mohammed al-Masari, but he was effectively an Islamic activist. But there doesn't seem to be in Saudi any kind of people's revolution. It doesn't seem to be that kind of political culture that they're going to sort of occupy the streets as they did in other countries. So it's hard to say. I mean, I can't really see that at all happening.
One thing I wondered, Sandy, I mean, when all this was happening, these Britons were being arrested over and over again and framed, a lot of people said, we don't have that much sympathy because these are all expats who went out to Saudi Arabia to make a load of tax-free money in the first place, and they knew this was a vile regime, so if bad things happened to them, tough luck. I mean, what's your response to that?
Fine. There's British expatriates all over the world, and if the British government's not going to protect those expatriates, then what's the point of having the rule of law? What's the point of having the British Armed Forces? The British government will commit its soldiers to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq, but they won't protect its own people when they're being tortured in Saudi Arabia or in other parts of the world. So perhaps one can argue, well, we took a risk. We went to a country with no real laws and an appalling human rights record. So let them take the chances. But if everyone thought like that, you'd have no aid workers in Africa. You'd have no British nationals doing whatever around the world, and we'd live in an insular little community.
Well, I mean, Mark, just to sum this up, I mean, where do you think we go from here? Do we shrug helplessly about the Saudis? Do we say we need their money, we need their political stability, we need their oil, we're stuck, or what?
Well, I'm not sure we necessarily do need their money. We don't necessarily need their oil. I mean, I think with energy policy going the way it is, there are a whole range of sources of energy that can be gleaned. We seem to be stuck into supporting American policy based on this cheap oil that is produced at very low cost from Saudi, and we just seem to be kind of just rigidly following the American line of supporting what Saudi does. I mean, one of the things that the Americans told me was that the Saudis are very useful in persuading the Gulf states to support American foreign policy. in terms of allowing them to use their military bases there, and that so Saudi is actually quite important on a strategic basis. But it just seems to me that why you can't have a non-aligned foreign policy, why you have to be so completely rigid. And if we need our defence industry so desperate to sell weapons, we can sell it to other countries. And it's just, for me, it just shows a lack of imagination, lack of flexibility. And but it doesn't seem to be any change. I mean, the new king of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah, is very conservative with a small c, very kind of cautious and moderate. And maybe the new generation, Prince Turki, the Saudi ambassador in the US, may be more, I don't know, trying to be more democratic. But it's very depressing, I'm afraid. But we'll see what happens when Brown gets in, but I don't think much will change.
So you're both depressed?
Prince Turki's been replaced by a man called Abu Jaber, who was basically the spin doctor for Prince Bandar, who was the previous ambassador to the United States of America. Basically, it's the family business is going on, and it's business as usual. Human rights out the window. Public opinion, they don't care. Unless they're forced to do something, they will not change. I'm not anti-Arab. I'm not anti-Saudi. I have many Saudi friends. But I will tell you this is a fact. Arabs respect strength. If you go to them with cap in hand, well, maybe you should do this, maybe you should think about that, they'll laugh at you. You go there and face them as a man and say, this is wrong, you should do that, they will listen to you.
Well, a final point about that. What sort of response has the book the two of you put together received in Britain? I mean, does anybody in Britain care one way or the other?
Well, I think they do in the sense of the topical importance of Saudi in terms of Al-Qaeda. And, I think Saudi is always going to be important purely because of oil. So, I think while we're dependent on oil, Saudi has that power. And while they have that power, they're always going to use it, and they're going to use that wealth. And they used it certainly during the Cold War to there's a new biography of Prince Bandar, the former Saudi ambassador to the US. It's an authorized biography. And he's absolutely brazenly open about how they use that wealth to influence American foreign policy. And, they're literally financing American foreign policy, writing out checks and using his influence, and just, it's just pretty brazen. So, I think everyone should be interested in Saudi, even if they're not.
Maybe we should open this conversation up a bit. Is there anything that anybody wants to bring up on this?
Yes, my name is Maya Mani, and I am from Saudi Arabia, from Mecca. And I find what is striking here is that not many people have come today for an important topic. I spoke to several Saudis, and I said, I'm coming. And they said, tell us all about it, but we don't want to be seen there. Fear. Now that said, of course I know that when you were in Saudi Arabia, there were many people who were sympathetic. And I also think that the policy makers here and the relationship, the government of the UK and Saudi Arabia work at one level. Specifically in the stopping of the fraud investigation this time. How many Saudis felt insulted that their culture is supposed to be a culture of taking bribes and corruption? Nothing is secret anymore. Where people used to hide corruption and bribes. At the moment in Saudi Arabia, many people who do believe in the ideals of democracy and democratic values and accountability and transparency are very disappointed So in other words, in the long term, it's not going to be very good for the relationship of the UK and Saudi Arabia, and not at all anything to do with the idea of stability. And it will be further delegitimizing the regime. So I know I haven't directly commented about your case and what you had to go through, but this idea, this denial of what, the denial and the importance of human rights and what you have to go through, and I will look forward to reading your book.
Well, there's one question I'd like to pick up on you. It's not true, is it, that bribery and corruption is a traditional part of Saudi culture?
Bribery is specifically against, Islam is against bribery and in the Quran. And here comes the double standards and hypocrisy. So on the one hand, this is an Islamic regime, Islamic state. And on the other hand, they're covering up for bribery. And you're talking about the royal family. It's also not very good for them that the British government has stopped this investigation. Because among the 22,000 princes and princesses, the Al Saud, not all of them follow this. You've been mentioning the distinctions among princes. So they have the few who have benefited from this.
Yeah.
And I know that in whether it's reform or justice, it's all very different. Naif and their security forces and the way they have dealt with you would probably be different if you looked at Abdullah, who's king now. So it's an insult to an Arab and a Saudi to say, well, that's a very special culture. They must be, and let's call it douceur. The majority of the Arabs who are unemployed and going through these systems where there's so much corruption, they know about it, and there will be a reaction.
Well, you've had a very distinguished background in analysing the Saudi situation, but I wonder how many Saudis there are inside Saudi Arabia who feel as you do. You're in a way, if you forgive me saying so, an aberration who has to live in London.
The Saudi regime, the royal family, and their allies, it's a coalition government, the Wahhabi religious establishment, look at the threat in their country coming from two directions. Terrorists, as they call them, fi'at dalla, and the people who are the reformers. Those who signed the petition 3 years ago, some have been put in jail and others, but until today cannot leave the country. Why is this significant is because these are the people, like myself, but I sit here in the UK and got British citizenship. Those people cannot leave the country. So we have choices, and that is, you sit in Saudi Arabia as academics and independent thinkers, and we get silenced and no freedom of expression or of assembly or of movement or irrespective of gender. Or come and sit here in the UK or abroad. And that is the sad story, not only for Saudi Arabia, but for some of the other countries, because it's the lost resources of the Arab world. And that's the creation of all these regimes. There is nowhere a significant liberal opposition in those countries.
Do you think there's anything constructive that the British government can or should do instead of its present attitude?
What you have mentioned about the attitude towards Saudi Arabia, ignoring the role after 9/11 of Saudi Arabia that has produced, because of its ideology, financing, education, the hijackers.
Yeah.
They ignored all that. They keep ignoring the role of Saudi Arabia because of oil. Now, I believe that Saudi Arabia should be treated like any other country. When I heard about this stopping of the fraud investigation, the first thing I thought, why can't they treat, or the West in general, Saudi Arabia like any normal country where corruption should be kept at a minimum? Why do they have to talk so much about this special relationship? Because in the long term, it's going to it's going to create so much resentment, frustration, and anger of the people. Because one day it's not going to be their Abdullah or Blair or further back, further like Mubarak or the others in those countries who they're protecting, who are going to, the future is going to be about the people. And they're only producing failed policies, backing failed states, and more anger in the region. And we really have to change, and we have to, whether we are British or Arab or Saudi specifically, to really make a decision for democracy, or at least human rights and the rule of law, and look at the people and their sense of dignity. Thank you for it.
Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, I agree 100% there with this lady. This government has cheapened the principles of Britain. They've sold the rule of law. They've sold our principles. They've sold what we hold most dear: a right to freedom of speech, a right to exist. Tony Blair has created this Human Rights Act, but he's flaunted it himself. It's okay having a Human Rights Act, but as long as it doesn't offend this country or this country. Now, a Human Rights Act is all right as long as it doesn't offend Saudi Arabia.
It's a bit odd to have an anti-bribery act that says you can't bribe anybody except Saudis. Mark, do you have a response?
Well, I think 2 points really. One, the West doesn't need Saudi as much as it claims it does. There are other forms of energy. There are other oil producers in the world, in Africa, Nigeria, the whole range of new areas where we can find oil, and we can sell arms to other countries. And even in the current situation in Iraq, Saudi is opposing the war mainly because it's a Sunni regime. And it is basically, there's almost a falling out now between Saudi and the West because of Iraq. And in the 1980s, Saudi was Iraq's biggest supporter. Saudi bankrolled Saddam Hussein. It was incredibly close to Saddam Hussein's regime. So I still don't quite get why the West is so embedded, so close. Seems why we have to give the Saudis such amazing latitude and allow them to get away with anything. But it doesn't seem to be. I think the economic and the political and even the strategic reasons are no longer there. As you were saying on the bribery issue, as you say, it's illegal in Saudi Arabia for this corruption to happen. And then the other argument which keeps getting wheeled out is that you can't do business in Saudi Arabia unless you bribe, unless you corrupt people. Well, it's like saying, you can't open a bar in New Jersey unless you deal with the mafia, or something like that. It's just a dishonest argument, and I sort of despair, quite frankly. But I think, in a way, Iraq may actually help may actually persuade, perhaps, Western governments to realise they don't need Saudi as much as they used to?
I have two...
Tell us who you are.
My name's Clive Bradley. I have two questions which I think are possibly quite stupid or naive, but the two things I really don't understand. The first is I understand completely the argument for why that you put for why the British government wouldn't do anything about British citizens being held prisoner and tortured. For all the reasons you gave, that's very clear to me. What I don't really understand is why the Saudi government would do it in the first place. Why would they, as you say, that they asked you to confess to things which would implicate the British government in Al-Qaeda? I don't understand why that's in the interests of the Saudi government, which kind of connects a bit to my second question, which is kind of on what you've just been saying. I mean, presumably the argument, to put it kind of, I don't wish to be giving the British government arguments in this regard, but the argument is that it's not just about our own sources of oil. It's that, given, as you say, that there is no liberal or democratic opposition to the Saudi ruling family, that were it to fall, it would fall to some kind of, extremist Islamist movement, which would then have control over the world's largest oil reserves, and that would be a huge threat to Western interests in general. And so, for all those reasons, bad as they may be, they're not as bad as the alternative. But the thing I don't understand is that that's an argument which cuts both ways. That the Saudi ruling family equally would, if it's in danger, its stability depends presumably to a huge extent on the enormous amount of arms that it gets from the West and so on. And so there is therefore the possibility of pressure being put on it by Western governments to reform. And yet, instead of doing that, they turn a blind eye to people being tortured. And I don't understand that either. I don't understand why.
Okay.
First of all, why did the Saudis blame us for their own domestic terrorism? Personally, I believe it was because Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda sympathisers had already infiltrated members of the Saudi security forces. That was reinforced later when when terrorists dressed as members of the Saudi security forces attacked Western compounds. When I was being tortured, my torturers spoke of admiration about Osama bin Laden, and in their view he was someone standing up to the West. Why did the Saudi government buy the lies of their own secret police? Well, it's like the king with no clothes on. He surrounds himself by his own entourage who tells him everything. And the king at that time was Gaga, and Abdullah was sort of in charge, but in reality Prince Naif was in charge. And he had his own agenda. In his own agenda, he's very anti-Western. He tolerates the West. He uses our technology. He uses our forces. And if they happen to have a war, he'll use our soldiers to fight the war for him. The fact is that they wanted someone else to blame. They did not want to admit to their own people they had a problem with Islamic insurgents targeting Westerners. Their own people knew it. The Saudis knew we were innocent. The Saudis knew from bootleg CDs and tapes sold in the black market about Osama bin Laden telling his people, get rid of the Americans, get rid of the Westerners in Arabia. They were only answering bin Laden's call. But Naif was not prepared to admit that. He had to hide that from his own people until the Vanel compound was taken out in 2003, killing 31 people and injuring more than 200 people. Then the Saudi government had to admit they had a problem with Islamic insurgents.
Maybe I should just explain, because those of you who aren't familiar with the history of it. I mean, the history is there were a series of explosions in various towns in Saudi Arabia, which were in fact the work of Islamic militants. And what happened was that the Saudis arrested a large number of Britons who either were not involved at all, or if they were involved in anything, were only involved in running bars and dealing in alcohol, which is a pretty minor and irrelevant activity.
Which were brought from the Saudis.
Which they brought from the Saudis, yeah. And so the problem for the Saudis was, as Sandy says, they didn't want to admit that Islamists were letting off these bombs. They didn't want to admit they had a problem with fundamentalists. Mark, do you want to deal with the second half of the question?
Yeah, I think the second is quite an interesting issue of the dilemma for the West in terms of, as you say, one of their slightly more legitimate strategic reasons for keeping the Saudis in power is that if they fall, it is, as you say, the Saudis are a very conservative, devout regime. Most of the people are very devout Muslims, and many of them are quite fundamentalists. So the problem is, if that regime falls, it's quite possible it could fall to an extremist Al-Qaeda regime, and may be corrected. But the problem for the West, if they support liberal democracy, if they support elections and traditional populist elections, the person who will become president of Saudi Arabia will be Osama bin Laden. And that's the dilemma that the West have of if they push for moderate reform or some sort of traditional Western democracy, Al-Qaeda will get elected. Now, I think I'm pretty sure that's right. Yamani may correct me there. And so they've got to find, they've really got to clean up their act, and that's why corruption is important. They need to reintroduce. They really need to become credible by ensuring that the rule of law is actually carried out, and just the staggering hypocrisies in terms of the strict laws on basic behaviour in Saudi Arabia, where ordinary, if you're caught stealing and all these you get unbelievable punishment, but if you're a senior member of the royal family, you do the same thing, nothing happens. And I think that's in some ways more as important to sort of modernise the regime.
Can I just keep this orderly? There's one at the back there first, and then you, and then back to you.
Yeah, Paul Halloran, I'd like to try and bring it back here, because we're talking about a country that's far away, and the issue that we're here primarily was flagged up as why the British government has imposed a security clampdown on a prosecution. It is a bit surprising for two reasons. Firstly, you would have thought this Labour government would be delighted that a prosecution would occur, because many Conservatives would fall under the axe, because the bribery and corruption in the Al-Yamama contracts was a result of the Conservative government and ministers in it. Moving on to the question of bribery, the Saudis will not see it that way. They will call it agents' fees, and for the purposes of this, there's nothing wrong in calling it that. If the Saudis want to take billions in agents' fees, let them declare it and pay tax on it, and their front men here. Then everybody will know we've got a position in this country in tax where you can claim a tax rebate on agents' fees. So on one hand, we're talking about problems associated with corruption, and the other way, we're giving tax breaks for it. Now, what you haven't been able to do, because it's probably imponderable, is that we do not know why this Labour government, when you would have thought would have all the political nous to punish the opposition by letting the scandal come out about the Al-Yamama contracts, and who in this country that was not Saudi got kicked back to, and how much money the Conservative Party really got in donations from Saudis that were very grateful for their support, why this should not come out. And Mr. Leigh has been banging a big drum and knocking on doors about this for a long time, as have others. Now, the final point I want to make, and I'm making more of a speech than a question or a comment, and I don't think that's particularly valuable, is that this will come out. Sooner or later, someone will open a door, documents will appear. Now, all I think that this government can do is hope and pray, and says, let's hope it's not in our lifetime so we don't have to clean up the mess. Because that's what it seems to me to be virtually what they're saying. National security, so what, maybe this, maybe that, maybe the other thing. The Saudis are exporting their Wahhabism through their charities right throughout the Middle East, into Turkey and into the Transcaucasus, to try and stifle criticism and keep their own people happy and keep the lid on it by exporting their fundamentalism. we are seeing, in fact, the results of it here, and we are paying for our own inability to stand up to this and our own inability to clean our own house.
Well, I think you're right. That wasn't exactly a question. It was more a speech, although it was an interesting one. So let's move on to the next person who's there.
Thank you. My name's Timothy Less. I'm just trying to extrapolate what the policy position would be from all the comments you've made. And in a way, I'd like to add a rider to the comment the gentleman there over there made when he pointed out that putting a little bit more pressure on the Saudi regime could easily result in a far more extremist regime coming to power than the one that we currently have. But if the conclusion from what you're saying is that we should be sending much tougher messages to the Saudis, putting much more pressure on, I'd then like to focus your mind on the potential trade-offs involved. We've been offered one in terms of the impact on the domestic situation, but it is. You also mentioned yourself that as the world's preeminent supplier of oil, if the Saudis were to constrain their exports to us, I mean, this would undoubtedly cause much economic pain in Britain and America and the West. I would add one other observation, which is that Saudi has played a very constructive role in the Middle Eastern region in terms of supporting Western policy in Palestine and Lebanon and towards Iran and Iraq. So my question to you, phrased somewhat provocatively, but why is it that you think that we should compromise vital UK interests in the region and towards our own economic well-being for the sake of a particular set of losers in the internal Saudi situation?
Well, Sandy, maybe you can answer that. Don't you think that it's all right to torture you for the sake of vital UK interests?
No. No, because, it was me 3 years ago, and if that regime is not put in check, the value of a British life becomes even cheaper. In Saudi Arabia, they have a tier system, and they call them third world nationals. At the very bottom of it, you've got the Indonesians, you have the Filipinos, you have the Sri Lankans, the Pakistans, and they are treated basically slavery according to where they come from. And at the top of the food chain is the British and Americans. Why should we compromise our relationship with this country? Because if we do not stand up to this regime, we become further down this food chain or this chain, and we become as lowly as the serfs and slaves they already have. Slavery still exists in Saudi Arabia. They just exchanged the word slavery to expat. A Bangladeshi road sweeper who works for less than $100 a month doesn't necessarily get paid, and he has to moonlight washing cars to have enough money to feed himself. The British are held in such high esteem where they have to pay us, but if our British government doesn't stand up for our rights, then we become as lowly as, in the Saudis' eyes.
Whose rights in this scenario?
The citizens' rights, British citizens' rights.
But what I'm trying to encourage you to think about is the various trade-offs involved. And what I'm putting to you is there's an economic dimension to this. There's a geopolitical dimension. And as the gentleman over there pointed out, it's not clear that tougher messages and a tougher foreign policy to Saudi would actually produce the outcomes that we desire.
Yeah, but I think you're slightly out of date in the sense of we don't need Saudi as much as we used to. In other words, our economic and strategic and energy interests are not as dependent on Saudi as perhaps they used to be in terms of reliant on oil sources, energy sources. There are other forms of sources of energy, other oil producers. If we diversified on our energy policy, we'd be less reliant on Saudi. We don't need them for strategic purposes. I think Iraq has shown that. We don't need their influence in that way. If during Sandy's case we suddenly withdrew diplomatic relationships with with Saudi and withdrew our embassy, then Britain's economic world would not collapse. I mean, it would not be far from. I don't think it would be even that damaging to treat Saudi in the same way as an independent, non-aligned state would not be hugely damaging for Britain's economic and strategic diplomatic interests. Certainly not now.
It's May again.
I'm going to be very brief. 3 comments, your comment and yours and your response, keep pointing out to something the Saudi regime wanted the world to fear and to beware of. We thought you get rid of us and we're going to have the extremists, the fundamentalists. The truth is that there is, after the Taliban, no Islamic state that is as fundamentalist or extremist as the Saudi regime and the Wahhabi religious establishment. The truth is, the longer we wait for reform, I'm not calling about, I'm not talking regime change or anything. The longer we wait, you might get a very radical Islamic government. At the moment, and I'm sure you know from your stay in Saudi Arabia, there are so many people who are educated, liberal, conservative, yes, but you've got the Shia in the eastern province, and they have nothing to do with the Osama bin Ladens or the Al-Qaeda of the world. You've got all those Hijazis by the Red Sea who are very tolerant and open, and they've got a cosmopolitan culture. Saudi Arabia is still, they still have a very educated middle class, and there are these people. But what's very important is they made everyone afraid of this story of one vote, one man, one vote. And that's, everyone is saying, and you say this, I know the people of Saudi Arabia of many years of research and writing about it. So
what do you think if there was an election? What do you think what would happen in Saudi?
Well, they did not really have, they had 2005, of course.
No, I mean a real election. I'm sorry, I mean a real
when they had their
election.
Partial municipal elections, only 1/4 of the male population were allowed to vote. It was, as you know how it was, only half elected, half appointed. The whole female population is, the way it was excluded, the way they did it was deliberate. That you see the results, we've got the Islamists. So everybody says we have to be careful. And then on Saudi Arabia, when the princes come to the West and they are dressed in Western clothes and speak good English and wearing very nice ties, you think they should be our allies here. But you don't know about the other groups who you know about, who control the judiciary, who control the most important levers of power, and they are the most rigid Wahhabi hardliners who are associated with Prince Naif and other conservative princes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have another contributor there.
Kate Joyce, private citizen. Sandy, this is a question for you. While it's obviously very important to get a better understanding of the political and economic relationship between the British government and Saudi, what I'd be very interested in learning about is perhaps fleshing out the details of your own story and how you were in Saudi, who you were perhaps with, how this happened to you, how you got through it, having come out the other side, what you hope to achieve through having to have gone through that, if you would allow.
Well, I was in Saudi doing anaesthetics as an anaesthetic technician. I was fitted up for a crime, as you know, I didn't commit. How did I get through it? Lived in solitary for 15 months. I developed a special relationship with myself and with God. And I used to speak to God on a regular basis, didn't always get answers, but I used to speak to him just as if I'm having a conversation with you, and that's how you get through solitary confinement. How you deal with torture is something entirely different. Basically, you sell your soul to your torturers because you will say and do anything to stop the torture, and you live with that for the rest of your life. Afterwards, we were traded for 5 Saudis who were arrested in Afghanistan and been held in Guantanamo Bay. Those 5 Saudis were released in a part of a three-way deal. The Americans sent them back to Saudi on the promise that Prince Naif would make sure they were prosecuted when they got to Saudi. Prince Naif released them within 6 months of being repatriated, and 3 months later we were returned to UK. I started my campaign when I realised I was being denied justice. The Foreign Office asked me, keep quiet and let us deal with this quietly. The Foreign Office basically lied to us. We had to go to court. We won our case in the Court of Appeals, and the British government intervened, giving immunity to our torturers. So now we've had to go to European Court of Human Rights. So the fight is ongoing. The fight isn't just for us now. Whether we win or not, it highlights what really goes on in Saudi Arabia. We were fortunate. We survived the torture chambers of Saudi Arabia. There's lots of people who do not. A lot of people just disappear. If I was a Filipino, if I was an Indonesian, if I was a Bangladeshi, my life is cheap.
I mean, who is we? Who is we? How did this happen in the first place? Who were you with?
I wasn't with anyone. A friend of mine, Russ Givens, who's a Belgian paramedic, gave first aid to a bomb victim. The Saudis added up 2 and 2 and made 12. Well, he was there at the bomb site, so maybe it had something to do with it. So they dragged Raf in, they beat him, and persuaded him to confess to being involved in the bombing. Then they wanted the names of all of his friends. Myself and Dr. Sampson were 2 of his friends. We were then picked up, beaten, and then eventually tortured. And that carried on until they extracted confessions from us. But they had to tell us what to confess to, because we didn't know what to confess to. You're the bomber, but okay, I'm the bomber then. Right, who gave you the orders? Now that blew my mind. Gave me the orders? Right. We know you do odd jobs for your embassy. My embassy? Are you crazy? The beatings and torture went on. Then said to me, you have a Thai wife. We can bring her in tonight, and you can listen to her screams in the cell next door. And it'll be your fault because all you have to do is confess. So I confessed.
Thank you.
Ginko Kobayashi, journalist based in London from Japan. I have a question, which is that why do you think British public is so complacent about this issue, including BAE and this particular issue? Because I haven't read your book, but I did read a book written by Mr. Bill Sampson. I was extremely horrified to death, as well as when I heard the news of the dropping the BAE case. And I think media, I'm not talking about British government, but British public and British media are so, they do not have much interest, and then the media's coverage was minimum, I think, maybe sometimes, except the Guardian on BAE recently. Why British public so easily persuaded by reasons such as for economic purposes? This is a matter of life and death. I don't want to go to Saudi Arabia after reading the book, and if I'm British, I don't feel safe wherever I go. So if you could tell us why you think British public is so complacent and there seems to be a lack of interest, media and the public, I would really appreciate.
Bill?
Well, I mean, it's hard. I mean, for me, this is like, I suppose I would say this is one of the most appalling scandals I've ever come across in 20 years in writing and journalism. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I think the reaction I've had to the book is that, to be frank, it's a very depressing story. If you read the first half of the book describing Sandy's case, because we had diaries and contemporaneous notes, and Sandy's sister, Margaret, kept very detailed contemporaneous diaries of conversations and meetings. And quite frankly, it's a very depressing story, and it's very graphic. I had to describe in some detail the violence and then the appalling complacency of Sandy in chains in the year 2002, being dragged into a room, and then a consul from the British Embassy comes in and barely recognises the problem and basically wants to make sure that he's still alive. And you think this is like 19th century rather than the year 2002. And I suspect, I don't know why, it's a depressing story. I mean, because you've got the human horror and you've got the fact that the British government did nothing, demonstrably did nothing, had no policy. And the answer is, I don't know. Maybe because it's Saudi, maybe it's far away, maybe it's complicated.
Well, I remember something. I mean, when we started to write about the case of Sandy and the others in The Guardian a couple of years ago, the public position then was all these people had been arrested and confessed. They were guilty. And that was the public idea. Yes, they'd all done it, I mean, nobody asked too many questions about why they should be letting off these bombs, but it was all accepted. The British government and the British diplomats knew perfectly well, of course, that this was all a frame-up and it was always all lies. But the pressure that was coming to say everything was normal and these were bad people and they were only themselves to blame. I know where it came from. It came from British Aerospace. This is an arms company with 3,000 people, expats out there. This has the key to the back door of Downing Street, as one of Blair's ministers said. They're a very, very influential voice. That arms company has exercised a lot of control over the way events in Saudi Arabia are seen. I think you would agree with that. And so we had a very hard job just to do the basic work and to say, look, here, we've looked into this. Honestly, these people didn't do this. These are British expatriates. The worst they ever did was drink some liquor in a bar. They haven't been going around blowing people up. It's all a frame-up. And when we wrote all that, I remember it's very uphill work to persuade people of that. Okay, have we exhausted the conversation?
Folks, not that depressing, by the way.
Actually, I'm told by some friends of mine still in Saudi Arabia that Saudi Babylon is the most popular book in the Riyadh underworld.
Well, that's good. Mark, do you want to sum up what do you think is where we've got to tonight, if anywhere?
Well, I hope people understand the bigger issue is not just what happened in Sandy's case, because I just think if people are interested in the world and how the world ticks, this is a sort of graphic case, and I think listening to Sandy's story and what happened to him, it's a very human story. I mean, not just the torture, but what happened to him afterwards. When he came back and coming back to the UK just before he returned, the Foreign Office were very. One of the things they were concerned about was that they didn't have to pay for his airline ticket to come back, and they want to make sure that his family paid for the airfare to come back. And it's just unbelievable, the series of events. And I just think if people can just think about the situation we are in the Middle East and how important Saudi is in the global economy, but just if you're interested in politics and you talk to your MPs, maybe we can try and raise this as an issue, and I just think that is obviously beneficial.
Yeah.
Do you have hope? I mean, do you think that going to the European courts would help? Would you win? Do you think it will change anything? And also for David with BAE case, I mean, do you believe that by writing about, I mean, would anything change? I mean, do we have hope?
Well, I'll just answer that briefly and then pass you over to Sandy. I mean, I've been writing about the BAE corruption case for 3 years now, and during that time we've written dozens of stories. And everybody became very, very bored, and our editors became bored. I think the readers became bored. In the end, we became very downhearted. In the end, curiously enough, what brought the whole thing into public salience was the backfiring of the government's attempt to kowtow to the Saudis by squashing this investigation. And actually doing that has actually set off a little wave of public astonishment and indignation, which was unexpected to us. And now, instead of being what we do, being greeted with yawns on The Guardian, now everybody wants to know. Now I have all the TV programs ringing up, Newsnight, Panorama, they're all on, they all want to know. So sometimes, if you just keep going, it is possible to actually touch people's feelings about all this in unexpected ways. So I'm not completely despairing. I'm a little bit hopeful that this time people have been genuinely shocked. What do you think, Sandy?
I think if we keep turning a blind eye to Saudi Arabia, then they'll carry on regardless, doing what they always do. I think it was the media's perseverance and exposing what was really behind what the Saudis were claiming was happening in Saudi Arabia saved my life. That and my very bolshy sister who just refused to say no. Is it worth it? Even if we don't win in the European Court of Human Rights, and if they uphold the State Immunity Act, because of the embarrassment we're causing Saudi Arabia, the next British nationals or Westerners who are imprisoned and sentenced to death in Saudi Arabia may not be as fortunate as us, because our values have already been cheapened. So we have to carry on.
Well, I think just finally the one positive thing actually is that the Saudis weren't tried on again, and I cannot believe that they will actually round up some expats almost at random, throw them in jail, kick the shit out of them, force them to confess, leave them in jail for 3 years. It's not going to happen again, so that's certainly one positive thing that's coming out of this.
Okay, well, I would just like to thank Sandy and Mark, and I would just like to say from my own experience, I think what they've done in this book is important and it's courageous. It's not easy to write about the horrible things that happen to you under these circumstances. I think it must be psychologically painful, and I think it's a tribute to your courage that you've brought this out. And I know as well that there isn't a lot of money in writing books about Saudi Arabia and its malpractices. This is not the way to get onto the airport thriller book stand and make your fortune. So I think your doggedness, Mark, is something that ought to be praised as well. And although this may not bring about immediate change, I think the dogged attempt to establish the truth about the rather contemptible way the British government behaves towards Saudi Arabia and the rather vile nature of the Saudi regime is something that we have to keep trying patiently, bit by bit, to assemble the facts about and expose. So thank you both for coming tonight.